we also have our top story today, which takes us to Washington, D.C. and President Joe Biden. Welcome to the show, John Gallagher.
Thank you,
How are you doing today?
I'm
that
fine.
was a throw. You thought I had Joe Biden on today, didn't you?
That would have been pretty awesome.
That would have been pretty awesome. So we're talking Joe Biden, the administration. Obviously, they don't want the railroads and the unions to split and stop running the trains. They want everybody to play nice and get a deal done. What's happening, my friend?
So what's happening is that they've been haggling over this for a couple of years now, as our colleague Joanna Marsh has been reporting about this contract, and it's been over. From what I understand, it's been over wages, basically over wages and benefits have been sort of the main sticking point. So this independent agency called the National Mediation Board stepped in earlier this year to start to kind of help kickstart the negotiations, and it's basically between the National Carriers Conference Committee, which represents the 5 Class 1 railroads in the U.S. and these 12 rail unions, which represent like 100,000 employees. The NMB has been involved up until last month, June 17th. They basically the NMB released these two parties because they couldn't come to an agreement, so they released them as part of the railway. The Railway Act. They released them from this process, which began a 30-day cooling off period, which ends on July 18th. And if they can't get to an agreement by then you have then what gets exercised is what's called self-help, which basically means the railroads can strike. And I think that also means the labor can strike, but I think it also means like the railroads can issue a lockout of employees. I'm not sure about that part, but the action that can avoid that would be if the president steps in and directs this presidential emergency board, and they can conduct hearings, and I believe they haven't done that yet, but they can basically conduct hearings and make recommendations on a settlement. It's not binding from what I understand, but it's really a big help. From what I understand, it has helped in the past because it's just kind of a major step, and they kind of, it gets the ball rolling again, and has led to agreements. And the reason that so that's what the chamber asked for yesterday, and also about last week, from what I understand, these 6 big shipper associations also pushed for this emergency board, and these are like representing chemical companies and fertilizer and grain and oil and gas. They also wrote to the president asking for this board, and they pointed out that this dispute comes at a time when you've already had all this major rail service disruptions over the last 2 years. Again, Joanna's report on them, and Mike Bowden-Distel's also talked about that too. So these shippers are saying basically, you add this additional disruption would push this stressed rail network to the brink, and you'd have, as we know, we have all this inflation going on right now, and so this would just like push, price impacts on food and energy and consumer goods even higher, and not just domestically. Rails also move exports, a lot of exports too. So it would help both like the domestic and it would hurt both the domestic and the export networks as well.
We're talking already about existing congestion on those inland ports and those inland railways as well. So, John, thank you for that. And speaking of Mike Bowden-Distel, he's our head of intermodal solutions here at FreightWaves, and he's with us now as well to talk a little bit about this perspective. And Mike, John brought up a really good point that there's this rail problem. If it stalls and if we see more disruption on the rails, it affects pretty much every sector, from CPG to larger commodities like fertilizer to energy issues. What are some of those big time issues or the big time roadblocks standing in the place of getting a deal done on the railways right now?
Yeah, that's right. It would impact a lot of industries in a lot of states, and a lot of states that are very important politically right before the midterm elections. So I think that's maybe the biggest reason why they were not likely to see a strike that at least lasts very long if that were to happen, later in the fall. Really, my thought after reading John's article is nothing in there was a surprise, and sort of the discussions are not progressing right on schedule, if that makes any sense. So I'm not expecting any, strike to happen in July. I think that's very unlikely. I'm reasonably certain a presidential emergency board is going to be formed, which is what those shipper interest groups were, asking for. And so when that happens, it'll kick off the second of the 30-day cooling off period. So for anyone who's not an expert in the Railway Labor Act of 1926, we're sort of late in the first cooling off period where there's 30 days to create the presidential emergency board, and there's 30 days for that board to conduct a hearing and issue a report, and there's 30 days later than that where before there could be a potential strike. So that would take us into September. And so, I would think that if it sort of comes to that and there's no agreement reached, Congress would intervene in a matter of hours, maybe days, but, don't think that would go on for very long. And it's probably, labor's in the driver's seat there just with a democratically controlled, Congress.
So, Michael, what are you seeing as the major sticking points here? And do you see one side having to cave over the other?
Well, it's always wages, right? The labor would say they haven't had a raise in a long time since they were working under the old agreement. The benefits are really strong at the unions. The unions, benefit from those, and the railroads would say, well, the labor should have to contribute a little bit more to those benefits. I don't know that the work rules that we've talked about before, going from two-man crews to one-man crews, is something that is really on the table if it's going to happen. This time, I think that's unlikely. Now for something such a radical change, at least from how railway operations are done now. So those are kind of the big things. I think that the labor probably just wants to drag this out, to the full 90 days. So we're into September, and it's actually a lot of pressure to come up with a deal, and pressure for Congress to intervene if it comes to that. So, I think that's sort of where we are.
Mike, and then I want to kind of talk about this, sandwiching it together with the ILWU negotiations on the West Coast with those port workers, because obviously what happens at the ports and what happens at the rails is very much interconnected. Is there any overlap of consequence or any overlap of problems that we could see from both of these negotiations if they hit worst case scenario and we don't see these things worked out in a timely fashion?
Yeah, I mean, either of those things could cause disruption, right? I mean, it's even if there isn't any strike and the workers work without a contract, which I guess is sort of what's happening on the West Coast. They're sort of working under the old agreement. That in theory that could lead to a slowdown in productivity, which could create additional bottlenecks and those type of things. So there are both things I think that everyone's watching, but ultimately don't know that either of those is going to be as disruptive as most people fear.
Yeah, hopefully not. I mean, a worst case scenario would be both strike, and second would be work to the rule at the port and a rail strike, because last time that happened, at least you had the kind of the relief valve of coming in through Mexico and Canada into the U.S., but that rules out rail as part of that relief valve, so things could get a little bit ugly. So your thoughts on this are kind of along the same line as mine, if I heard your implications right. It's really labor side, if they agree to something before the deadline or soon after the deadline, then it doesn't feel like they've put all their cards on the table, and they want to make sure that they've done that, right? So stretch it out to the end and make somebody intervene, and you've proven your worth, kind of thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And so far, labor's gotten exactly what they wanted. I mean, they got released from the mediation early. I think that was about the fastest they've ever, labor's ever gotten released from the mediation. They wanted to get released quickly, so it would still potentially go to Congress while there's still a democratically controlled Congress. Who knows what happens after the midterm elections, but all this is going to come to a head before the midterm elections. So I think labor's in a good spot.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Thank you so much, Michael.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and for full perspective on both of that, you can head to freightwaves.com and check out John Gallagher's article from this morning that just dropped. Right now, we're going to head over to The Wall. We've got our first carrier update of the morning with Tony Mulvey and Donnie Gilbert.